Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Africa in Focus with myself, Kwame, Ghanaian writer, broadcaster, historian, podcast and entrepreneur. And in this edition of Africa in Focus is a special African violence against Africans in South Africa. Who benefits? So that's the theme for this week's show. Africans fighting Africans in South Africa, who benefits? So this is because of a viral, if you've probably seen it already, a video went viral last week of a Ghanaian being accosted and even attacked by a group of so-called Black South Africans who are against so-called foreigners entering the country. So we're going to discuss that. What is the origin of this? Is it true that Africans in South Africa are taking space for Black South Africans, so-called? Or is there a more sinister agenda behind this? Before we start, if you like what you hear, please share to your friends, family, social media networks. Subscribe to Ghana African Fix on YouTube. Hit the notification bell, meaning that every time we upload a new podcast, YouTube will notify you. Again, we're also on Spotify. Look out for Ghana African Fix on Spotify. Hit the follow button, meaning that Spotify will notify you every time we download a new podcast on Spotify. All right, and if you want to help us donate to the show, we'll happily accept donations to help us continue to bring some fantastic content coming from Ghana and from the African continent. And so if you'd like to donate, you can donate as little as $3 a month. You can either do it as a one-off payment or as a monthly installment. So if you'd like to donate, I will leave you the link to how you can donate on the finish to the show. Okay, so let's get into this podcast. And we call it Afriphobia in South Africa. Who benefits when Africans fight each other? So, for me, like I said, this podcast has been predicated by a disturbing event that happened in South Africa last week when a video went viral, and I'll clip that video and article again in the furnace to the show, so that if you haven't seen what's going on, then you can see and hear for yourself the nature of the Afriphobia in South Africa. So there's a wound in the body of Africa that we don't often like to talk about. Okay, so let's start by naming it correctly. So this is not so like I said, let's start by naming this thing correctly, because language is political and language shapes reality, and language is also important in framing this whole issue that we're talking about today. So what's happening in South Africa is not xenophobia, because xenophobia means fear of foreigners, all foreigners. But nobody is burning German bakeries in Pretoria. Nobody is attacking white Australians in Cape Town. Nobody is chasing Chinese investors out of Stanton. So this violence is targeted, it's specific, and it's racialized, and it's directed at African so-called migrants. So whether they're Zimbabwean, Mozambicans, Nigerians, Congolese, Ghanaians, Malarians, etc. Okay? This is Afriphobia, pure and simple. Not xenophobia, this is Afriphobia, or Afriphobia, which is a fear of hatred of Africans by other Africans, shaped by history, economics, and political manipulation. Yeah, so we're going to tell you about the numbers. Yeah, so the numbers are quite disturbing. So since 1994, so this violence didn't start with the Ghanaian person, last week. This has been going on for basically since South Africa got independence in 1994, so-called independence, but it's been manifested so particularly in the last 10 to 15 years. However, since 1994, hundreds have been killed. Yeah. Tens of thousands of Africans have been displaced or been sent back to the other parts of the continent where they came from. entire communities literally live in fear. So this is not a misunderstanding between, one African group to another. This is actually a crisis. But crises don't appear off thin air. And today we're gonna explain to you how this issue of so-called Black Africans venting their anger and frustration and hatred on their fellow African brothers and sisters. So, like I said, this crisis didn't appear out of osmosis. It's either engineered, or they're inherited, or they are taught. Okay? So let's get back to the root, where this thing, the origin of this viciousness that so-called Black South Africans have for their fellow Africans. Now let's get to the origin of this thing. And it starts with the apartheid regime, the wicked, wicked white system of apartheid that relegated Black South Africans to subhuman status. Yeah? So this is the root of it. Yeah? Apartheid, isolation, and manufactured ignorance. Now check this. Apartheid wasn't just a system of, wasn't a system of divisiveness, because apartheid is a Dutch word meaning to separate. Yeah, it wasn't just a political system. It was a psychological project, and it was also a social engineering experiment. Many of you are not aware of that. I want to say that again. Apartheid was not just a political system. It was a psychological project and a social engineering experiment. So for decades, so-called Black South Africans were deliberately isolated from the rest of the continent. There was no free movement. There was no cultural exchanges to learn about different African cultures outside of South Africa. There was no shared education, and there was no content to consciousness. Yeah, outside of Steve Biko, but Steve Biko died 77. So we're talking post-Mandela, post-1990, yeah? So the apartheid state fed Black South Africans propaganda that Africans from the north were backward. So Africans from the north, this is even Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe next to South Africa. But anything north of South Africa is basically, north, yeah? So Africans from the north were backward. This is what they were taught. That we were dangerous, yeah, that we were invaders, and that they were terrorists. This was an intentional ploy by the white, vicious apartheid government, yeah, because the people disconnected from their content of family and roots are far easier to control, yeah? I want to say that again, so that you understand why so-called Black Africans were brainwashed by white apartheid, yeah? Because when you disconnect a people from the rest of the continent, right, they become easy to control. And that's what apartheid did. Apartheid was a control mechanism system where it controlled the psychology, yeah, and the behavior of so-called Black South Africans. Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black history in the Western Hemisphere, he wrote a book called The Miseducation of the Negro. And in that book, there's a very, very telling passage. Carter G. Woodson says, and I quote, "When you control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his actions." I want to say that again. When you control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his actions. So this is what apartheid did. They used propaganda to control the actions and behavior of so-called Black South Africans. So 1994 ended the political structure of apartheid. However, the psychological effect of the apartheid regime was not gone. It was still there. It is still there. So this resulted in no mass political education, no decolonization of the mind, and no rebuilding of the Pan-African unity. So when economic pressure hit, when unemployment rose, when the state failed, and we're coming to the failure of the ANC later on in the podcast, the old apartheid narratives were still there, waiting to be activated and waiting to be exploited by those who have the agenda. Let us look into this issue about some of the triggers to tell you about the origin of it now. We're now going to touch on some of the material triggers that have, caused the anger and resentment among so-called Black South Africans. Now, let's be honest. And I've said this numerous times when talking about South Africa. South Africa is one of the most one of the most unequal societies on earth. Yeah? I want to say that again. South Africa is one of the most unequal societies on earth. Black youth unemployment is above 50%. Townships like Alexandra outside Cape Town, Soweto outside Johannesburg, these townships all over the country, right, have people with no jobs, no safety, no public services. Think about it now. You're basically living in a ghetto, even worse than a ghetto. You got a government, the ANC, struggling to deliver even basic dignity, like running water, electricity. These things are in short supply in a lot of the townships in South Africa. In that environment, yeah. So given that what I've just said, right, about the state of the townships, right, given that environment, anger is inevitable. But the anger needs direction. So when the state fails to provide solutions and hide behind excuses, someone must be blamed. Yeah? And migrants become the easiest target. But before I go on, this is very similar to what's happening in the UK. In the UK, all of the problems that is in the UK, that affect white people in the UK, whether it's housing, social housing, lack of decent public services, why you can't get a decent school for your child, why the libraries are shutting down, why the high streets are shutting down, and why you can't get your hip operation for your grandmom, is all been blamed on so-called mass migration in the UK. When the reality is, it is a failure of the state, i.e. the UK British government, to provide public services and investment in its people. The same in South Africa. So because the ANC, and we'll come to ANC, because they're a big part of this African, Black South African so-called resentment and anger on their fellow brothers and sisters. Because they failed to provide solutions and they've failed in their governance of the country. So somebody must be blamed. Not them, but somebody must be blamed. And that somebody are African so-called migrants. You see, I hate that term, migrant, because that's a European term, African migrants. How can an African, now check this out, how can an African be a foreigner or a migrant in his own continent or his or her own continent? Think about it now. That's like saying that, a European is a migrant on European soil. It doesn't make sense. So when we say African migrants, right, we are missing the point, because the African can't be a migrant on African soil. However, because of the language, and this is why I said at the beginning, language is very, very important. Migrants, so-called, have become an easy scapegoat because why? They're visible, they're more likely to be vulnerable, and more importantly, they're unprotected. But hear what? Here's the truth that our Black South African brothers and sisters don't understand and do not want to contend with, right? It wasn't African so-called migrants that created apartheid. It wasn't so-called African migrants that took your land to the extent that white people who created apartheid illegally occupy 80% of your land. It wasn't African migrants that designed the economy as it is, that makes you sub-education normal in your own country. It wasn't African migrants, yeah, who stole your land. It wasn't African migrants who stole your gold and resources. It wasn't African migrants that privatized the mines. Yeah, it wasn't African migrants that collapsed Eskom, which is your energy provider. Yet, the very same migrants that did not do any of this, they are the ones who are paying the price for the ANC's failure to provide stable government, good leadership, and opportunity and jobs for the majority of Black South Africans. So this is not really about jobs. This is about misdirected rage. So because you don't understand, yeah, what really going on in South Africa, you blame your frustration, you blame your anger, vent it on your African brothers and sisters, who, by the way, have come to the country with their own money. They didn't get any state handout. They came with their own money. The Ghanaian, the Nigerian, the Zimbabwean, the Malawian, the Kenyan, whatever, they have come to South Africa with their own money and set up businesses whereby they're employing Black South Africans, so-called. So how are they taking job? They're not taking your job. They're actually creating job. Now, let's get into the issue of who or what is fanning the flames of this Afriphobia in South Africa. Now, violence does not spread on its own. It needs oxygen, it needs amplification, and it needs architects. And in South Africa, there are several architects of this whole violence. So one of them are vigilante movements. And I mentioned groups like Operation Dudwala. I mentioned Operation Dudwala about 3 or 4 years ago in a podcast that I did. Yeah? And also there's another group called Put South Africa First. These two groups have basically built their entire identity on anti-African immigration. That is so stupid. Anti-African immigration. And like the clip that I'll leave on the furnace of the show, the leader of Operation Dudwala said, "We are sick and tired of African migrants." Oh, really? And you don't know that under the African Union, just like in Europe, Africans have a right of free movement of goods and services and people. So a Ghanaian can live and work in Nigeria. A Nigerian can live and work in Togo. A Togolese can live and work in Senegal. A Senegalese can live and work in South Africa. That's the whole premise of the African continental free trade area, whereby people, goods and services can move around. But these groups, Operation Dudwala and South African First, have used propaganda, innuendo, and misinformation, particularly on social media, to push their message of hate. Because this is what this is: hate on your own African brother and sister without really any clear and accurate, story. Yeah. There's also political actors. So some politicians in South Africa have discovered that anti-immigrant rhetoric wins votes. Same as in Europe, same as in America with Trump, same as in UK with Reform UK. All these politicians, right, feed on misinformation, intimidation, and misinformation and miseducation to whip up public support for them. And this is what some politicians in South Africa have done. They've used anti-immigrant rhetoric to win votes. So it is easier, and this is coming from the ANC as well as the Democratic Alliance. So it's easier to blame a Zimbabwean shopkeeper than to explain 30 years of failed governments. Yeah, and we're going to go into that in a minute. Just taking a brief water break there. So we're now going to get into state complicity. Yeah. So the police often stand by, and the clip that I'll show you, right, that I'll put on the furnace of the show, the South African police did nothing when this Ghanaian was being harassed by misguided, misinformed Black South Africans. Yeah. So police often stand by and let these attacks happen. Cases go unprosecuted. Yeah, and impunity becomes the new normal. Now, when the poor fight the poor, nobody looks at the corporations, right, who are making billions from South Africa every year. So Operation Dudwala and Put Africa First, they are not, or they are conveniently ignoring the big multinational companies who are ripping the blood, who are bloodsuckers out of the South African economy by taking billions of dollars out of the country. They ain't talking about that. Nobody questions land ownership. This is something that I've said time and time again in South Africa. These people, you've allowed white people to take 80% of your land. And that's from 1913, where the land grab became legalized, so-called, under the so-called Native Land Act of 1913. You don't talk about that. Nobody challenges the mining giants. These black South Africans, these so-called black South Africans, you don't challenge the De Beers, your Anglo Ashanti, who are ripping, stealing your birthright, making billions of dollars every year from your birthright, which is your resources. And also nobody is integrating the banks like Stanbic Bank and others that make billions of rand every year. And that money is not accountable to the ordinary man and woman in South Africa. So yes, there's a hidden hand in this whole Afriphobia violence in South Africa. But it's not foreign, so-called. It is domestic, it is political, it is economic, and it's structural. So now we move on to the ANC. This is another issue of the problem. So I've told about why the coward black Africans, why you're not attacking the white man. Because like I said, it's not we Africans who took your land illegally. That's the white man. It's not we Africans that took your diamonds and gold and bauxite and what have you. It's the white man. It's not we that control your economy. It's the white man. Stanbic Bank, MTN, Castle Brewery, DSTV, ShopRite, Game. I can go on and on and on. These are not owned by Nigerians or Ghanaians or Congolese or Sierra Leone. These are owned by white people who are making billions while you suffer in squalor in the townships. But you don't want to vent your anger on them because you're a coward. Because you know the white man got a gun and he's ready to shoot it at you. So you go and attack your innocent Zimbabwean shopkeeper, your innocent Ghanaian trader, the Nigerian taxi driver. You attack them, you coward. So now, let's move on to ANC. And they're the crux of the problem also. So let's talk about the ANC. Because you can't understand what's going on in South Africa right now without understanding the failure of the so-called post-apartheid settlement. For me, and I said this before, but I'll say it again, this whole Nelson Mandela thing was a scam, right? Because no man spends 27 years in jail and then comes out and in less than 4 years becomes president unless there is a carefully systemic script behind that. And I'm saying that Nelson Mandela that came out in 1990 was not the same Nelson Mandela that was put in prison in 1964. To the extent that I believe that Nelson Mandela was a clone. The one that came out of prison was a clone. And even Winnie Mandela was able to recognize that because she recognized that Nelson that came out was not the same man that she married. So, when the ANC came to power in 1994 with their promises of land redistribution, economic justice, black empowerment, jobs, housing, etc. This is what the ANC, this is what the program with. But, and this is where the but is, the big but, the so-called negotiated settlement, of which the current president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, he was the architect of that settlement that is now governing the country. That settlement protected white corporate power. that entailed the mine stayed in white hands, the land stayed in white hands, and the banks stayed in white hands. And moreover, the total control of the economy is stayed in white hands. So even though Black South Africans got political freedom, and that's even debatable, without economic liberation. So they got political freedom, but they didn't get economic emancipation. And when the ANC failed to deliver on the promises of jobs, of housing, of land distribution, the anger had to go somewhere else. Yeah? So instead of the ANC, Mandela downwards, Thabo Mbeki, Jacob Zuma, and now Ramaphosa, instead of confronting the structural power of white apartheid. And this is why I said apartheid is still live, because white people still control the country by stealth. So instead of confronting that white system, the capital that dominates South Africa, the rage was redirected elsewhere, i.e. so-called African migrants. Because it's easier to be an African migrant than to challenge the white power structure. So, this is not an accident, beloved. It is political misdirection and political miseducation. Now, with all this, all the violence, right, and all the nonsense of Black South Africans killing their fellow brother and sister, right, let's go on to the next point, the great betrayal. Because in the video that I will leave on the footnotes, right, the woman talks about we should fix your own country. Oh, yeah? But you didn't know that if it wasn't for African people on the continent, you would still be illegal as apartheid. Because it wasn't the white man that gave you a circle of freedom, right? That freedom had to be that freedom had to be blood had to spill. Yeah? The blood of Chris Hani, the blood of Stephen Biko, and many, many others were lost. Remember the Soweto Uprising, 1976, the Sharpeville Massacre, 1960, etc. Yeah? And many Africans, yeah, on the continent. I'm talking to you so-called Black South Africans, because I know I've got some listeners in South Africa. You don't understand, because your parents have not told you this history. You don't understand that you did not liberate yourself. It was a continent that carried South Africa. For example, Tanzania, which is part of the frontline states, Tanzania hosted ANC camps. Zambia sheltered your exiles. So your leaders like Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, Governor Mbeki, the father of Thabo Mbeki, yeah, the president after Nelson Mandela, they didn't seek exile in North America or England or Germany or France or Ukraine. African states like Zambia sheltered your exiles, your leaders. Mozambique, particularly under Samuel Machel, paid in blood for supporting the struggle against white minority rule. Nigeria alone gave more than 50 million US dollars. So Nigerians that you want to say are criminals, the Nigerians that you want to attack, these same Nigerians, yeah, gave $50 million to the ANC and MK in Kuntumi Sizwe. Yeah? And also countries like Ghana, Algeria, Libya, Ethiopia, all provided training, money, and diplomatic cover. So African nations opened their borders, their homes, and their treasuries. And today, you dumb, good for nothing Black South Africans, you are hunting the children of these Africans who helped you through the streets of Johannesburg, Cape Town, etc. So, this is not just about violence. This is historical amnesia. You forgot what we did for you, or you forgot what the rest of the content did for you. This is betrayal, big time. And so, before we go into a consequence of this action, I want to say to my Black South African listeners out there, don't forget that many Black South Africans, yeah, in Ghana, in Nigeria, in the Gambia, in Kenya, in Zimbabwe, etc., doing business freely. No one's attacking them. But just imagine, we turn around now and do to you what you're doing to us in South Africa. How would you feel? And add to that, if Africa got its act together, we will boycott your big companies. Hit you where it hurts in your pocket. So we boycott MTN. MTN is the biggest telecommunication network on the continent. We boycott that. That will sink your economy overnight. Just that one company. Because they're making billions from Africa every year. MTN. We boycott DSTV. We boycott ShopRite. We boycott Game. We boycott your banks. That could destroy your country, beloved. Yeah? Is that what you want? Is that what you want, South Africa? So, let me tell you now of some of the consequences of this violence if it doesn't stop. So, Afriphobia, on this point, is not just a South African problem. It's a continental problem. Because when Africans fight Africans, right? Yeah, and we see this also in Ghana. Ghanaians attacking Nigerian shopkeepers because, not because they're illegally, but because Nigerians can do better business than Ghanaians. And that makes Ghanaians jealous of Nigerians. Yeah? Again, we see this in other parts of the continent, yeah? So when we fight each other, it weakens the African trade content-free area, which is a project whereby Africans have the right to move freely all over the continent along with their goods and services. When we fight each other, free movement collapses. When we fight each other, regional and continental integration stalls. When we fight each other, diplomacy fractures. And we see now, there's kind of fractious relationship between Ghana and South Africa, whereby Ghana has summoned the High Commissioner of Ghana to South Africa, to see what the hell is going on. When Africans fight Africans, right, external powers can gain leverage. So like the Chinese, like the Lebanese, like the white man, like the Indians, they can use our fighting of each other to use that to their advantage and think to themselves, look at these Africans. You see, you sort of see these Africans, they kill each other, they're fighting, yeah? And so we can't build a continent. And this is what people like Nkrumah, Sekou Touré, Lumumba, all these African leaders shed their blood for. You can't build a united Africa while Africans are killing each other over the borders that were drawn in Berlin. So these borders that we're fighting on, right? These borders were not drawn by Africans. They were drawn by the enemy in the Congress of Berlin in 1884. So apart from making this violence immoral, it is suicidal because we are destroying the essence of Pan-Africanism and unity, what the likes of Nkrumah fought for. And so I'm in closing. What must be done, what should be done. So South Africa, first of all, must confront the truth. And the truth is, migrants are not your enemy. The white man is the enemy. He stole your land, your resources, and created apartheid. Inequality is also the enemy. Corruption, particularly of this ANC government, is also the enemy. White domination, white supremacy, yeah, is also the enemy that you Black South Africans must confront. The ANC must act. It must end impunity. It must prosecute attackers. It must regulate Operation Dudwala and South Africa first. And it also must protect African brothers and sisters who have come to the country to create jobs. Thirdly, African governments cannot stay silent. We've got to correct South Africa on this. So diplomacy must be firm. Pan-African institutions must intervene, yeah? Whether it's through sanctions or whatever, we've got to intervene. And also, lastly, we've got to teach history of liberation movements in South Africa. Teach the economies of neo-colonialism and teach the meaning of African unity, because our people in South Africa don't understand this. They've been brainwashed by white apartheid to thinking that A, they're not Africans, that B, they're better than the rest of us, and that C, that is those Africans who have taken your resources. So that's why we've got to teach the meaning of African unity. And so, Afriphobia is not our destiny. It is not our culture. It is not just the way things are. It is a political choice, which emanates from a historical inheritance from apartheid. It is a failure of leadership, and it is a failure of imagination. However, all is not lost, because the same content that fought apartheid together can fight Afriphobia together. It is in our collective interest as Africans to fight this cancer of African against African violence wherever it raises its ugly head. And so I thank you for listening to this week's edition of African Focus with myself, Kwame, Ghanaian writer, broadcaster, journalist, podcast and entrepreneur. And in next week's edition, we've got another special for you. Why Africans in the UK must leave the UK, because UK is not what it is. UK is not what it is. And there's a lot you don't know about the UK. So Africans in the UK, you got to leave that country. So we'll talk about that more in next week's show. So for myself, Kwame, more the crew here, thank you for listening. And please subscribe to Ghana African Focus on YouTube, Ghana African Focus on Spotify, and also we're also available on all the other podcast providers. All right, so for myself, Kwame, and the rest of the crew here, thank you very much for listening. And we'll see you next week for some more African Focus.